Here's what nobody tells you about ancient Greek warfare. These were people who worshipped war gods, built their entire masculine identity around combat, and named their children after battle victories. The Spartans trained boys to fight from the age of 7. Athens sent 18-year-olds to die on the front lines before they'd ever kissed anyone. War wasn't just a political option for the ancient Greeks. It was practically a religion. And yet, every single year, without fail, the entire Greek world stopped fighting, put down the spears, sent the soldiers home, and just paused, not because they ran out of weapons, not because some empire crushed them into peace. They did it voluntarily, repeatedly, for centuries. And they did it for two reasons that are going to sound almost absurd when I say them out loud. Harvest and sports. That's right. The civilization that gave us democracy, philosophy, mathematics, and some of the most brutal military tactics in human history decided, collectively, that olives and running races were more important than killing each other. And the wild part? It worked. For over 1,000 years, it actually worked. So if you're the kind of person who likes history that actually makes you think, not the sanitized textbook version, but the real story underneath, hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because this channel is built exactly for that. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching this from. Seriously, every time I ask that, I get answers from places that genuinely blow my mind. Let's see where the history behind the scenes community is spread across the globe today. Now, let's get into this. Because the real answer goes so much deeper than most people ever learn. Most people who've heard about the Olympic truce think it was some kind of ancient feel-good tradition, like a handshake agreement between city-states who wanted to play nice for a few weeks. A charming footnote in a history textbook somewhere between chapters on philosophy and architecture. A moment where shared culture briefly triumphed over political rivalry. Athletes competed, crowds gathered, and then everyone went home and went back to trying to kill each other. They are completely wrong. In 776 BC, or thereabouts, the Greek world was fracturing. The city-states were constantly at each other's throats, and two kings, Iphitos of Elis and Lycurgus of Sparta, sat down and carved something into a bronze disc. Not a peace treaty, not a declaration of shared values, a binding, sacred, legally enforceable ceasefire that invoked the protection of the gods themselves. It was called the Ekacheria, which translates, roughly, to holding of hands. But don't let the gentle name fool you. This was a document with teeth. City-states that violated it faced something that, in the ancient Greek world, was almost worse than military defeat. They faced religious exclusion. They could be banned from the games entirely. And being banned from the Olympics in ancient Greece wasn't like being banned from a modern sporting event. It was a mark of shame that followed a city-state for generations. It damaged trade. It damaged diplomacy. It told every other Greek city that you could not be trusted, not even when the gods were watching. The truce wasn't a kindness. It was a mechanism of control, more powerful than any army. But here's the part that should genuinely disturb you. This wasn't just about the Olympics. The Greeks weren't pausing wars once every 4 years and calling it a day. They had multiple sacred truces, woven into the calendar like circuit breakers, built specifically to interrupt the cycles of violence before they could spiral out of control. The harvest truces, the religious festival truces, the truces for the Pythian Games, the Isthmian Games, the Nemean Games. Some historians estimate that at certain points in Greek history, there were more protected, truce-bound days in the year than there were days when warfare was actually permitted. Think about that. A civilization we remember as warriors had systematically engineered most of its year to be off-limits for war. And somebody decided that. Somebody designed that system. Somebody understood that without it, Greek civilization would eat itself alive. Who were they? What did they actually know? And why did the system eventually fall apart? That's exactly what we're going to find out. Because the deeper we go into this story, the more it starts to sound less like ancient history and more like a warning. Let's start with the commonly accepted version of events, because there's a version of this story that most people have heard, and it's not wrong exactly, it's just incomplete in a way that strips out everything interesting. Most history lessons present the harvest pause simply as agricultural practicality. Of course, you don't fight during harvest season. Your soldiers are farmers. If you march them to war in September, your food supply dies. It's common sense dressed up as tradition. And for the Olympic truce specifically, the textbook version gives you a clean, satisfying arc. Every 4 years, the Greek city-states set aside their differences to celebrate athletic excellence in honor of Zeus. The truce allowed athletes and spectators to travel safely across hostile territory. It was civilized. It was enlightened. It was proof that even a violent world could find moments of shared humanity. And if you're a student sitting in a classroom, that version gives you what you need to pass the test. But what it doesn't give you is any real sense of why the system worked, how it was enforced, who built it on purpose, or what it tells us about the people who lived inside it. The textbook version treats the truce like a happy accident of culture, something that emerged organically because the Greeks were, at their best, a thoughtful people. What it hides is far more interesting. The truce wasn't organic. It was engineered, and it was engineered in response to a very specific crisis. By the 8th century BC, the Greek city-states had developed something extraordinary and terrifying in equal measure. They had figured out how to fight. Really fight. The hoplite, the heavily armored citizen soldier, was a military innovation that made Greek warfare extraordinarily lethal and extraordinarily accessible. You didn't need a professional army. You needed citizens who could afford armor. And when those citizens clashed in phalanx formation, shields locked, spears leveled, moving as a single mass of coordinated violence, the result was absolute, decisive, bloody. Wars that used to be prolonged and logistically nightmarish could now be settled in a single afternoon. And that meant city-states were fighting more often, not less, because the cost of entry was lower, because victory felt achievable, because your neighbor's olive groves were right there, and you had 300 men with spears and nothing particularly pressing this Tuesday. The people who were paying attention, and there were people paying attention, priests and oracles, and the strategically minded administrators of Panhellenic sanctuaries like Delphi and Olympia, they understood something profound. If the city-states were allowed to fight completely freely, without interruption, without pause, without any sacred obligation to stop, the Greek world would eventually reach a point of mutual exhaustion from which it could not recover. The truces were their solution, and they were brilliant because they didn't try to eliminate warfare. They simply interrupted it rhythmically, at points in the calendar that were already culturally significant. They layered sacred obligation on top of existing tradition. They made the ceasefire feel natural, ancient, ordained by Zeus himself, and therefore almost impossible to argue with publicly, even if privately you thought it was inconvenient. Now let's talk about the specific people who built this system, because they deserve far more credit than history usually gives them. Start with Iphitos of Elis. The ancient sources, Pausanias, Strabo, describe him as the man who revived the Olympic Games in the 9th or 8th century BC in consultation with the oracle at Delphi. The story goes that Greece was being plagued by famine and civil strife, and Iphitos asked the oracle what to do. The oracle told him to restore the games and declare a sacred truce, so he did. Now, is that story literally true in every detail? Possibly. But even if you strip away the divine consultation and read it purely politically, what you see is a ruler who recognized that his region, Elis, the territory that controlled Olympia, had an extraordinary asset, a sanctuary, a site already considered sacred, a place where Greeks from across the fragmented world already came to honor their gods. And he leveraged that asset into something that gave Elis enormous political power for centuries: the role of permanent custodians and enforcers of the Olympic truce. Elis was not a major military power. It was not Athens. It was not Sparta. It didn't have the largest army or the most silver mines. But by being the guardian of Olympia, it had something more valuable than either of those things: moral authority backed by religious fear. If you attacked Elis, you weren't just attacking a city-state, you were attacking Zeus. And even the Spartans thought carefully about that. Then there's Lycurgus of Sparta, who, according to tradition, co-signed that original bronze disc with Iphitos. Whether Lycurgus was one man, a mythologized figure, or a composite of several people matters less than what his involvement represented. Spartan buy-in. The truce only worked if Sparta respected it. Sparta was the preeminent military force in the Greek world. If Sparta decided the truce was inconvenient and kept fighting anyway, the whole system would collapse overnight. The fact that Sparta supported it, even helped create it, tells us that Spartan leadership understood the system's value. That restraint, paradoxically, was part of what made Sparta powerful. Discipline includes knowing when not to fight. And then, there are the priests of Delphi. The oracle at Delphi was perhaps the most politically sophisticated institution in the ancient world. It sat at a geographic crossroads, received delegations from every corner of Greece, gathered intelligence that modern intelligence agencies would genuinely envy, and issued guidance that was always carefully calibrated to serve the broader stability of the Greek world. When Delphi endorsed the Olympic truce, it wasn't purely theology. It was geopolitics wrapped in the language of prophecy, and nobody in the Greek world had the standing to argue with it. If you want more untold history like this, subscribe to History Behind the Scenes, new episodes every week. For centuries, the system held. Not perfectly. We have records of violations, of city-states that pushed the boundaries, of armies that moved through territory they were supposed to leave alone. But on the whole, the Ekecheria was respected. The games happened. The truces were observed. The Greek world kept its circuit breakers intact, year after year, generation after generation. And then came 480 BC, the Persian invasion. Xerxes, crossing the Hellespont with an army so vast that ancient sources described it as drinking rivers, dry as it moved. And here's the extraordinary thing that happened in that moment. Greece was in the middle of an Olympic year. The games were scheduled. The truce was in effect, and the city-states that were desperately trying to organize a defense against the greatest military force the world had ever assembled had to do so while simultaneously navigating their sacred obligations to the ceasefire. Some states used this as cover, hiding behind the truce to justify delay in sending troops, to explain their paralysis, to mask their secret negotiations with Persia. The infamous Medazers, Greek city-states that collaborated with or submitted to Persia, could point to sacred obligations as a convenient excuse for inaction. "It's complicated," you can imagine them saying. "There are religious considerations. We cannot simply abandon our obligations to Zeus." But the invasion also revealed something that no one had fully accounted for. The truce system, for all its genius, had never been designed for an external existential threat. It was a tool for managing internal Greek conflict. It had no protocol for the moment when the enemy came from entirely outside the sacred circle. Persia didn't care about Zeus. Persia wasn't bound by the Ekecheria. Persia looked at the Greek world's elaborate system of sacred pauses and saw not a sophisticated civilization, but a disorganized collection of small states too busy honoring tradition to mount a unified resistance. The answer the Greeks found, the extraordinary pan-Hellenic coalition that eventually turned back Persia at Salamis and Plataea, was itself a kind of improvised sacred truce, a temporary unity forged in crisis. But it was never formalized the way the Olympic truce had been. And the moment the Persian threat receded, the city-states went straight back to fighting each other. The Peloponnesian War followed within a generation. And it was the Peloponnesian War, not Persia, that finally broke the Greek world's back. Here's what the consequences of this system look like when you zoom all the way out, across centuries, and why they matter far more than most history books ever acknowledge. The harvest truce, the informal but deeply observed practice of not fighting during planting and reaping seasons, meant that Greek agriculture was protected from the most destructive potential of their own warfare in a way that compounded enormously over time. Greek farms, particularly in places like Attica, were extraordinarily vulnerable. Olive trees take 15 to 20 years to reach full productivity. If an enemy army swept through your territory during harvest, burning groves and trampling fields, the damage wasn't just this year's food supply. It was a generation of agricultural capacity gone. The truces, by keeping armies off the land during the critical seasonal windows, functioned as an agricultural insurance policy that allowed Greek farming, and therefore Greek economic stability, to survive, despite near-constant conflict. Then, look at what the Olympic Games specifically created over centuries of repetition: a pan-Hellenic identity. Before the Games became what they became, Greek was a loose, contested cultural label. There were Dorians and Ionians, Spartans and Athenians, islanders and mainlanders, colonists scattered from the Black Sea to southern Spain. The thing that unified them, the thing that made them feel like one people, despite different dialects and slightly different versions of the same gods, was the shared experience of the Games, the shared obligation of the truce, the shared pride in athletic excellence performed before an audience drawn from every corner of the Greek world. This identity mattered enormously when Persia came. It is not an accident that the coalition resistance was organized around the same networks, the same sacred sites, the same messenger routes, the same political relationships, that the Olympic truce had been quietly building and maintaining for centuries. The truce didn't just pause wars. It built the infrastructure of Greek unity that made any coordinated defense possible at all. Without the Games, without the truces, without the centuries of Greeks gathering in the same place and recognizing each other as something more than strangers, there may have been no coalition at Salamis. And without Salamis, the story of Western civilization looks very different. But there's a darker ripple effect that sits alongside all of that. Because the truces created a rhythm of violence and pause, they also, in some ways, normalized and institutionalized warfare during the permitted seasons. When peace is sacred only sometimes, war is implicitly sanctioned the rest of the time. The truces may have moderated Greek warfare, but they also gave it a kind of divine permission structure. We are at war now, and the gods have not said otherwise. That's a powerful psychological endorsement. The very system that kept Greece alive may also have been the system that kept Greece perpetually at war. Here is the reframe that I want you to sit with, because I think this is where the story becomes genuinely important, rather than just fascinating. What the Greeks built with their sacred truces was not a peace system. It was a violence management system. And the distinction matters enormously. The people who created the Ekecheria, Iphitos, Lycurgus, the priests of Delphi, they were not idealists. They were not dreaming of a world without war. They were pragmatists who looked at their society clearly, accepted that it was going to fight, accepted that warfare was baked into the culture at a level too deep to simply legislate away, and then asked a different question. Given that we are going to fight, how do we interrupt the fighting often enough and at the right moments that we don't destroy the things that make fighting worth anything in the first place? That question is one of the most sophisticated questions any civilization has ever asked about itself. And the answer they built, layered, religiously enforced, economically motivated, culturally celebrated, functioned for over 1,000 years. It outlasted most of the city-states that created it. The Olympic Games continued under Macedonian rule, under Roman rule, until the Emperor Theodosius finally abolished them in 393 AD as a pagan institution. That's over a millennium of a system fundamentally designed to tell human beings, not now, not this week. Put down the sword and come to the games. What does that tell us about human nature? It tells us that human beings are capable of building remarkable systems of self-restraint, but only when those systems are wrapped in enough cultural, religious, and economic incentive to make compliance feel like self-interest rather than sacrifice. The Greeks didn't stop fighting because they became peaceful. They stopped fighting because not stopping would have cost them something they valued more than victory in any individual battle. That's a lesson about power. Real power, the kind that lasts, is not the power to win every fight. It's the power to choose which fights not to have. The Greeks understood this. Elis understood this. Delphi understood this. And they built an entire calendar of sacred interruptions to enforce that understanding on a culture that, left completely to its own devices, would have annihilated itself centuries before Alexander the Great was ever born. And here is the final thing I want to leave you with, because I find it genuinely haunting. When the system finally broke down, when the Peloponnesian War dragged on so long and so destructively that the sacred truces became increasingly difficult to enforce, when Sparta eventually violated the sanctuary of Olympia itself, when the city-states finally exhausted themselves past the point of recovery, Greece didn't fall to Persia. It fell to itself. Exactly what the truce builders had been working for centuries to prevent. Philip of Macedon didn't conquer a powerful, thriving Greek world. He walked into the wreckage of one that had finally, after all those centuries of managed violence, forgotten why it had been managing the violence in the first place. The lesson isn't that the truces failed. The lesson is that they worked for so long that the Greeks eventually forgot they needed them. And I think that's worth sitting with for longer than this video lasts. If you've made it this far, genuinely, thank you. This is the kind of history that deserves more than a paragraph in a textbook. And the fact that you're here means you're exactly the kind of person this channel was built for. Subscribe right now if you haven't already. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. And like this video if it made you think differently about something you thought you already understood. Drop a comment with the thing that surprised you most. I read every single one. Next time, we're going into a story that connects directly to this one. A Greek general, an impossible decision, and a moment that changed the entire trajectory of Western history. You are not going to want to miss it. I'll see you then.